Hi, Megan.
Hi, Robert. How are you?
Oh, I'm pretty good. Now, you're, I think, in Vietnam?
I am in Vietnam. I am actually no. I'm sorry. I'm not in Vietnam.
You're not in
I'm
Vietnam?
Getting a little confused. I've been traveling for 10 days. I'm in Cambodia.
You're in Cambodia.
Yes,
Okay.
I return to Vietnam tomorrow, but
Oh, okay. Well,
I'm
that's
doing
different.
a sort of whirlwind tour of Asia, or of two little bits of Asia.
Okay, so you've been mainly in Vietnam over the last...
Yes, I was in Vietnam from all of last week, and then on Saturday we came to Cambodia.
Well, this is our first Southeast Asian dialogue.
Oh, really? I'm the inaugural. I'm
You
the inaugural
are.
ugly American.
You are. Congratulations. You've been selected meticulously from a large pool of applicants. As the ugliest American we could find, Megan.
I'm not surprised, frankly. My hair in the Cambodian humidity is not doing well.
Really? It's what do we?
Yes.
Got a little.
We're talking like serious sort of
Little-
gigantic, curly, frizzy, straight-ish, really ugly-looking hair.
Okay.
But you know what? I feel that my strength is the strength of 10 because my heart is pure, and a nice little Cambodian lady has promised to take care of it tomorrow at the spa in the ridiculous hotel that I'm staying in.
And all of this is costing you nothing. You're on some kind of junket, presumably paid for by somebody who wants you to spout some sort of propaganda. Do you want to tell us what kind of propaganda that is?
It's actually it's weird. They don't want us to spout propaganda.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Not that I wasn't prepared to I mean the hotel that I'm staying in is really like something out of the Raj. I feel like I'm in an Agatha Christie novel. But no, they don't. It's the German Marshall Fund, and they do these tours as a way to actually promote fellowship between European and American journalists.
And communist dictatorships.
Something like that, yes. We've heard a lot from the communists.
No, go ahead.
Well, they're not from the actual communists, but from their lackeys in the Vietnamese and Cambodian industrial base over the last 10 days. Yeah,
I thought maybe it was paid for by the Vietnamese government, and you were supposed to say nice things about Vietnam. But I'm glad to hear that you're at liberty to say unkind things about any group of people, with the exception of Germans. We just won't talk about them at all.
Don't mention the Germans.
I mean, we should say there's a little lag, but we're doing Skype and we're a long way away, so there's a slight lag in conversation. So we may have a little awkwardness there, but it's coming in pretty clear. I got to say, I'm warming up to the Skype concept. So what are your impressions? Had you ever been to Vietnam?
I had never been to Asia before. This is the first time that I've been on a 14-hour plane flight, and it's an amazing place. I mean, actually, I would say the biggest surprise that I had with this is how nice everyone is to Americans.
Really? Vietnam?
I think you come in Vietnam and in Cambodia. You come into both places sort of thinking you're not sure exactly how people are going to react to the fact that you're an American. And people are just, amazingly friendly. The first day here, I had to get a passport photo for my Cambodian visa. Mm-hmm. And so I go into this little Vietnamese store behind my hotel where no one speaks any English. And they took my picture for $1.50 and gave me 2 passport photos with a digital camera. And this guy with no teeth who's, it's like, he's totally excited to have me in there. And he's like, oh, sit down, have some tea, here, have a cigarette. And I was mentally calculating, the cigarette had to cost 10 cents, and then there's the tea, and then there's the toner and so forth for printing the photo. And I was like, every time he offered me something else, I was sort of mentally calculating their profit margin and cringing. But they're incredibly nice. They're all.
How do you know he wasn't just hitting on you? I mean.
I guess it's possible, but he let me go.
Well, I didn't mean plan to abduct you. I meant. Never mind. I'm sorry, but I'm too cynical sometimes. Yes,
I didn't
they're
get that
warm and
vibe.
wonderful people, and I'm glad to hear that presumably, if middle-aged male, showed up, they might be just as nice. I'm not sure, but that's good to hear. Because, let me ask you this. Are you getting the same sense from your journalists whose demographic category precludes the possibility that guys are hitting on them? Like, they're also impressed by how friendly
I think everyone's been impressed. And, the European journalists, for the American journalists being in these places and when the war comes up, there's a silence. You don't really... It didn't really come up. But, if it came up in passing, the American journalists mostly... You don't want to say anything because... Not because we're afraid to admit that something bad happened 30 years ago, but more just because you don't want to raise the possibility of saying something wrong. The European journalists had much less shyness about that, and so a couple of times they asked, how do you feel about having the Americans here? How do you feel about selling so much stuff to them? And the Vietnamese always said, we export a lot, and that's a long time ago, and we like the Americans. They're all, of course, in my case, there were always Americans there, and I don't know that I personally would have the guts to, I guess the closest example would be to tell a bunch of Japanese people that we really still deeply resent Pearl Harbor, but...
they have their issues too, I think, but anyway... Well, go ahead. Sorry.
No, but in general, they've just been. Everyone has been incredibly nice, and and it sort of breaks your heart in a little way because everyone is so poor compared to us. And so when they're giving you things, you don't want to take them because you're taking something that they could really use, but you also don't want to refuse anything because, of course, it's terribly rude. They're making a nice gesture.
Wow. And because you hear that there has been a considerable reduction of poverty since Vietnam kind of plugged into the global market, right? There has been.
No. I have to say, being in, when we were in Vietnam, we went to Vietnam first, and then we came here to Cambodia, and I will fly back to Hanoi tomorrow night before I fly home.
Now, have you been in both South and North Vietnam? Were you in?
I went to Hanoi and to Ho Chi Minh City,
which formerly Saigon,
formerly known as Saigon,
right.
It's been a really exhausting trip, I have to say. This is my fourth. I'm in Siem Reap now, where Angkor Wat is, and this is my fourth city in 10 days.
Wow,
which is a lot, especially because everyone is so jet lagged. I still haven't managed to get 8 hours of sleep. Despite the fact that my doctor, my very accommodating doctor, gave me sort of a gigantic thing of Ambien, which I've been religiously taking. I still wake up.
That stuff gives me a hangover. I can't use it. But
oh, really?
True.
That's
it's sad.
Awful. I can't imagine.
It is awful. And I think we should all pause to mourn that fact. But I think I sidetracked you from. You're about to talk about the economic situation. I mean, there is some economic vibrance there, and
you go to Hanoi and you think, wow, this is really poor. There are people who come in from, because the countryside is really relatively close to Hanoi, so there are people who come in from the countryside carrying basically a yoke. I have some pictures on my website. They basically, it's a stick, and at each end, suspended from the stick, are sort of a shallow basket. And in that shallow basket, there'll be a little pile, in each of the two shallow baskets, there'll be a little pile of cucumbers or bananas or something. And then they'll squat. The other amazing thing is everyone in Asia, or everyone at least in the bits of Asia that I've been in, squats really well.
Yeah.
And they do it from childhood, so they can just sit and squat for hours. So they'll squat by the side of the road and they'll sell the stuff out of these baskets. And you look at that and the labor productivity implied by spending your whole day selling like a couple of things of cucumbers and bananas, and carrying them in on this stick, or bicycling in. I saw someone bicycling along with a cow in a trailer attached to the bicycle. Which sort of reversed everything that my family ever taught me about what farm animals are for. And so you think this is really poor. And then you get to Cambodia and you realize how wealthy Vietnam is and how far it's come in the last 20 years. Because in Vietnam, like, there's traffic everywhere. Everyone's on these little scooters. It's funny because the traffic moves at scooter speed, but it's incredibly crowded, and you just have to. It's like a river. There's no. To a first approximation, there are no traffic lights in Vietnam, and so you just sort of wade into this river of motorcycles that's going everywhere all the time. And they're just incredibly wealthy compared to Cambodians.
And where do you see the economic vibrance? I mean, I gather they're manufacturing some electronic products and things, right? I mean, presumably the people on the motorcycles are not the same people who are selling the cucumbers. Are there kind of just two?
Yes and no. There are people. I mean, people in the countryside will have motorcycles. Not as many as the people in the city.
But the people in the city are doing what for a living?
They can be doing a lot of things. They could be working in the tourism industry. They could be working in a manufacturing company. They could be working in a small business selling things to other Vietnamese people. I mean, this is when I say like the economy is vibrant. First of all, Cambodia has one industry. It's got a garment trade that is basically based on the fact that they have a special deal from the United States because they have higher labor standards than they've got a special labor standards that they adhere to. And in exchange for that, and also because they're really small and it's just not that big a deal for American protectionism, they can sell to the American market without quotas. And so there's a lot of factories located here. There's about 300,000 people out of a total population of 14 million who are working in these garment factories. Most of them are young women. But that's it. That's the whole industry here, and tourism. And those are really it in terms of business. They don't make anything. They have no ports. They import food. They barely produce enough rice they're really, really, really poor.
Well, and presumably the genocide, I mean, as I understand, I don't know that much about it, but I gather that a primary criterion for killing people was whether they were educated.
They killed off anyone who could speak French. They killed off anyone who was educated. They had a famine. What they did to the economy caused a lot of people to die just from hunger.
But they kind of fairly systematically wiped out a lot of the educated class, right? I mean, I've even heard of cases where they would walk up and hand somebody a written document or something upside down, and if the person knew to turn it right side up, they would kill them. Maybe that's I don't know.
Everything I hear about from the people that I've talked to about the killing fields, certainly the people who are old enough, and most Cambodians aren't old enough to remember it. Like half the population is under the age of 20. But the people who were there say it's one of those situations where one of those rare situations where in fact it was exactly as bad as you've read about.
Huh.
It's like the Holocaust. It just boggles your mind. This is not exaggerated war stories. It really was that tragic. And yet, I'm not clear. It depends on who you talk to, right? Most people here that you talk to attribute a huge percentage of the problems and I've blogged a little bit about this, there's a mantra in development economics right now that's called, that people say institutions matter.
Mm-hmm.
And Cambodia has a huge number of problems. There's huge corruption. Something like half the population is illiterate. They just don't have any institutions for doing even really basic things. The schools don't work. If you send your kid to school, they don't pass or fail the kids according to who has learned the material. They pass or fail the kids according to whose parents have paid the teacher off. So there's all these huge problems with the institutions. And most of the people that you talk to blame it on the Khmer Rouge. The American ambassador, we interviewed him for an hour the other day in Phnom Penh, and what he said was, when Pol Pot said he was going to take this country back to the year zero, he actually did it. Yeah. He killed all of the educated people. Even things like agriculture, which you would think they would have kept, right, because everyone's in the countryside, but they had all of these people from the city who didn't know anything about growing rice. And everyone was resettled. And so agricultural yields plummeted, and they've never recovered. They're at a fraction of what they are in neighboring countries. And it's not, so they'll say that it's the Khmer Rouge, but on the other hand, other people that you talk to will say, look, that's an excuse. Not that the Khmer Rouge wasn't terrible and didn't do a huge amount of destructive damage, but, corruption was a problem before the Khmer Rouge. And the fact is, and this is true of Vietnam too is most people. There's a tendency, especially among conservatives, to blame what happens there on communism, and the Khmer Rouge and communism in Vietnam have certainly obviously retarded the growth a huge amount. I mean, you compare them to Thailand or places that didn't have communist regimes, and it's clear that the communist regime just devastatingly held these countries back.
Yeah.
But the fact is they were poor, and they had corruption problems before. And most places in Asia had corruption problems because most places in the world have corruption problems. And it's really pretty unusual to live somewhere that doesn't. And so you read about Singapore or Hong Kong in the 50s, and it's actually, what you're reading about is just really astonishing corruption. And they solved that. So, I mean, that's the hopeful thing, is that those problems were actually fixed.
You mean the corruption problem was fixed in those places?
Hong Kong and Singapore managed to get rid of the same kinds of levels of corruption, or from what I'm told, the same kinds of levels of corruption that there are here.
Okay. And here being both Cambodia and Vietnam. Yeah.
Cambodia is worse than Vietnam. Cambodia is really terrible. We were at Angkor Wat this morning, and it's beautiful. It's the most amazing place on earth, and you walk. It really is. Sadly, I guess for me, because I would like to be one of many of the people I'm with had been there before and had been there before tourism took off. And the nice thing is that the South Koreans are coming here in droves because they're wealthy and they have money to travel now. The downside is the Cambodians. So Angkor Wat is now, which shocked me, it's about as crowded as Athens, which is the most crowded tourist spot I've ever been in. When you go to the Acropolis, it's like being a herd of buffalo being herded across the Great Plains.
Now, Angkor Wat, I gather, was actually originally a Hindu temple and became a Buddhist temple, centuries ago. But is it still used in religious practice?
No, it's a tourist destination. It's an amazing. It's gigantic. The scale of it is huge. It's beautiful. It's falling down in places, but it really is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. The problem is the Cambodians haven't mastered. The Greeks are actually really quite good at getting you through the Acropolis, and I found that the Acropolis too was spoiled by the fact that there were about 3,000 other tourists there. But at least the tourists go through in sort of like an orderly line, and they time it, and so that people aren't all going up at the same time. This was just like it was a mob. And at one point, I was literally sort of packed in about as tightly as cattle in a pen, with about 400 South Koreans on a balcony, and we just gave up trying to go into the building that we were on because it was so crowded. Anyway, so we're there, and they're building this. They're doing a light show, like the way they do in the pyramids in Cairo. They're doing this like dancing light show, and everyone is appalled by this, including the commission that is supposed to recommend what to do with Angkor Wat. They asked them, "Should we do this light show?" And the commission said, "No, you should not do this light show." But the person who's running the light show, I'm told, is the daughter of the head of the Cambodian government, and so.
Well, there you go.
Light show.
More nepotism and corruption. So, in terms of the government situation, and especially in Vietnam, I gather that it's a case kind of like China, where it is one-party rule, and we still call it the Communist Party, but it's really not, because the economic system is capitalist, right? So am I right? You have this combination of fairly free markets with not so much political freedom. Is that what Vietnam is like now?
Yeah, all of the press is owned by the government in Vietnam. So this is worse than Cambodia, actually. This is the press is wholly government owned there. And
so Cambodia is freer than Vietnam right now?
Cambodia is freer than Vietnam. The radio is a little bit free. The television is not free, but the print press is freer than Vietnam.
Okay.
Certainly. In part, though, because so few people can read here, that it's not as big a deal. It's not
dangerous. Yeah.
It's not as dangerous as having a free press in Vietnam. I wouldn't call Vietnam, or China for that matter, strictly capitalism. Because there's a huge part of all of this stuff that is still controlled by the government, right? Like a lot of the industries are state-owned, and there's a huge sectors of the economy are still controlled, like fuel prices and electricity and so forth.
Now,
in a way that a lot of is true in a lot of developing countries that aren't communist. So it's not free. There's a lot of planning still that goes on, and part of it is you sit in these meetings and people talk about their industrial plans, and it's kind of it's heartening in a way, and it's also distressing in a way, because they're talking about things like building a Vietnamese auto industry. And the auto industry has a really high, what they call minimum efficient scale. Like, for example, airframe manufacturer has probably the highest minimum efficient scale of any industry everywhere. The efficient number of airframe manufacturers is probably 1.
So you have to be doing a huge quantity of business in order to make it an efficient process, you mean?
Yeah, and auto manufacturer, because the plants have to run at a very high capacity in order to break even. I was told once that it's something like 85%. I don't have an actual, but whatever it is, it's much higher than normal kinds of plants, which is one of the reasons you can't do what everyone thought we were going to be able to do with the internet, which is order your car the way you order a Dell, because they just have to do long production runs in order to make it cost effective. But so they're talking about having an auto industry. Well, there's 85 million people in Vietnam. It doesn't really make sense for Vietnam to have an auto industry, but of course, like, China has an auto industry, and South Korea has an auto industry, and Japan has an auto industry. So Vietnam wants an auto industry too, and by Jove, the government's going to give them an auto industry.
Well, but that's pretty. It's a pretty big. 85 million is actually a lot of people. I mean, it's one of the 20th biggest countries in the world, right? Which I was kind of surprised by.
Yeah, it's. And it's this long little noodle of a country too. It's.
So, but you don't think
that's.
Well, you don't think the auto? I mean, I was just, in China and Japan and Korea, I guess, in all of those cases, the auto industry started out as a statist initiative, right? And so, I mean, I guess the Vietnamese would say, you can laugh at us now, but it's worked in the past. I mean, are you saying that if their goal is to cater to a domestic market, there's not going to be enough demand to justify the production scale that brings efficiency, or
it's going to be awfully hard for Vietnamese. Most of these things start by catering to the domestic market, and then they export. Things like the auto industry, right? Okay. But it's going to be really hard for the Vietnamese to compete with the Koreans on quality or the Chinese on price domestically. Yeah. So you say, well, why an auto industry? Why does every country in Asia have to have an auto industry? Canada doesn't really have an auto industry, and it's okay. Canada gets along perfectly fine buying cars from other countries, and they do stuff that they do well.
So what is Vietnam doing well?
I mean, there's still a heavy element of that in the Vietnamese economy.
And what is Vietnam doing well right now? Small scale electronic manufacturing, or what?
They're doing booming. They're still a little below. They're booming in garments. They're picking up huge garment trade. They're making their own. Making their own is a strong word. Because they're sort of assembled from parts that they get elsewhere. But they're making motorcycles. Honda will manufacture motorcycles in Vietnam now, they make. They do low-level electronics. They do assembly. They're behind their neighbors. They're behind all of the other countries in Asia because the communist regime did retard growth for a long time, and they opened up. They opened up 15 years behind China. So they're, but there's a real chain in industrialization that usually starts with textiles, and then as you get workers more productive and more used to working in factories and all of this, they move up the value chain. And Vietnam has just started that process.
And is the government yet running into the problem that the Chinese government, I think, is running into, which is to say that as you start creating fairly affluent people, or at least the middle class, and they start buying like cell phones and stuff and getting plugged into the internet, they're not as easy to control as a single-party authoritarian government might like, and China seems to kind of have its hands full. I mean, the various interest groups mobilize to complain, to press grievances on the government. It finds it has to respond to them. Are you seeing any of that kind of restlessness in Vietnam, or is the government just having an easy time of it still?
The government is still having at least, from what I can tell, and I'm on a guided tour, and we didn't have a lot of time to go off by ourselves. But really, from what I can tell, there isn't a huge amount of dissent. In part because the party rules with a relatively light hand. In part because everyone in Vietnam is so nationalistic, and they're surrounded by all of these giant countries that are more economically successful than they are. And they're really just focused on one thing, which is making money and developing. And so, people there, it's not clear how much people care about having one party rule. The journalists that I talk to, they're okay with working for a state-owned paper. Which would be, shocking for an American journalist to work for some place that can say, like, we're just not reporting about this week. But, most of the stories that they cover aren't really affected, and they don't really seem to. I mean, obviously, they wouldn't necessarily go off the record and start. Some people, they want more. They want the journalists want to be part of a free press. They want. People want anti-corruption. They want more development. They want more privatization. And some of the things, it's funny. Like, we had one guy who was lecturing us on how Vietnam isn't doing enough to take care of people, and how it's gone in some ways too far in the capitalist direction, and the healthcare system has suffered. But then the next breath, he was like, "Well, we need higher school fees because the schools aren't good enough." And we need to charge people more so that we can make the schools better. I mean, all of the people we talk to are just intensely focused on getting rich. And
are there many?
All the other stuff comes after.
Are there many people who have the tools of kind of empowerment? I mean, are there many people? Are there a lot of cell phones?
Yeah.
Is there a lot of internet access?
There's huge cell phones. Almost everyone has electricity except in like the rural mountainous areas. Internet is really common in the cities and is spreading out into the countryside. People have the tools, and the Vietnamese government doesn't have the resources that China does, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that you hear over and over again, especially in Vietnam, is just how much of a bully China is to its neighbors. The big thing that the Vietnamese are upset about right now, or one of the big things, is the Spratly Islands, which they're sort of claimed by all of these.
I didn't even know Vietnam was involved in that dispute. That involves Japan, right?
Oh, yeah.
And
they had a deal with BP, and BP pulled out because China said, no, we dispute that. We dispute the territorial claim. And so they're outraged about that. But internally, right, China has a lot of power to say to, like, Yahoo, if you don't crack down on and help us make it so that people can't search, stuff we don't want them to get from China, then you can't do business in China. And Yahoo looks at 1 billion consumers and says, okay. Vietnam is 85 million people, and they just don't have the power to force people outside to comply with their clampdown. So I think that Vietnam is not going to be able to do the same thing that China did with keeping that kind of level of rigid control.
Yeah, because I gather, I'm not sure exactly what kind of libertarian you are, but there are libertarians who think, and I kind of subscribe to this view myself, that economic liberty tends to foster political liberty. It's not that easy to reconcile, a fairly free market system with extremely repressive authoritarianism. And so anyway, for people of that orientation, the expectation would be that it'll be hard for Vietnam to have it both ways for a long time. So first of all, is that your orientation, that you think there tends to be...
There is a level, I'm convinced that at somewhere around 6,000 per capita GDP, which is on a purchasing power basis, which is not just looking at exchange rates, but looking at how much it costs you to actually live in the country, that somewhere around 6,000 per capita GDP, something changes. and people, they've got enough to eat, and once they've got enough to eat, and they're not terrified that they're going to die of some hideous disease and not have enough to feed their kids, they start demanding freedoms that they didn't have before, like freedom of the press and so forth. And you saw it in like South Korea. You've seen it in other places.
And what are the numbers for Vietnam and China, respectively, right now in that regard?
Vietnam is it's on a exchange rate basis. It's about 800 per capita, but on a PPP basis, it's much higher than that. It's 3,000 or 4,000. China, actually, I don't have figures because they just revalued because their GDP just had a huge downgrade. I don't know if you saw this. So last time I looked, anyway, someone was preparing, and my internet access here is extremely spotty, so I'm not getting as much data from the outside as I want.
But China is closer to that threshold than Vietnam, but not beyond it yet. Mm-hmm.
It's not yet beyond it. It's probably around 4,000 to 4,500. It was the last number that I had for their GDP.
Okay.
But as I say, the news was that they were that people were preparing to revise that downward by as much as 40%, saying that the Chinese government's just not good at accounting for prices and inflation, which is certainly true. No one here has good statistics on anything.
Now, the seeming exception to your rule that people would cite, I guess, is Singapore, right, where you're above that per capita threshold, but you've got a fairly authoritarian government and some version of capitalism. And I've always thought that might have something to do with the fact that Singapore is just really a city-state, and that changes things. But what's your line on Singapore?
I would say it's not an ironclad rule, right? Like, you also have countries that are really poor in Africa that have made amazing steps towards democratization. And you have countries in Latin America that so I would say it's folly to talk about iron rules. I think there is a tendency as people get richer to demand these things, but it's certainly, Germany was above that level of per capita GDP when it got Hitler. So you don't want to say that it's some sort of iron rule, but I just think that, yes, as these countries get richer, and there's another thing too, I go back and forth on the development stuff because there's been a lot of pressure from people like William Easterly to crack down on governments and stop giving them aid when they don't reform, when they don't have democratic freedoms, but also when they don't do good economic things, right? Don't give them aid when they don't fight corruption. Don't give them aid when they control prices or they have these crazy export subsidies or whatever it is that they're doing that are really hideously distorting bad ideas that keep their people in poverty. Punish them by taking the aid away.
And you're in favor of that?
And, on the one hand, these things are things that shouldn't happen. Corruption is one of the worst things for an economy you can imagine. It's just really immensely destructive, especially with things like the schooling here, right? You got a generation of kids who, are they getting educated? Who knows? And their teachers aren't paid well, and it's hard to blame the teachers. It's a whole terrible cycle. And it affects everything from the top to the bottom. But at the same time, what the people at the World Bank will say is, yes, that's true. But the only way that we can punish the government is to punish the poor people. Right? They can't punish the officials. The only people they can take money away from are like the HIV. The U.S. ambassador actually said this as well. He said, "Look, I was at the point 3 years ago where the government was acting in ways that we really didn't approve of, and Washington was saying, do something about this." And he was like, "Well, what do you want me to do? All I've got left is HIV/AIDS funding. Shall we cut it?" And so there's a limit, first of all, to the extent of the stick, but also the fact is that the only way that you can push these things, unfortunately, usually is by taking away money that is at least ostensibly. But so I go back and forth. I really do on what the right way to treat these problems is.
I guess
I would say, but.
One virtue.
Anyway, go on. Sorry.
One virtue of kleptocracy, where the rulers are actually just pocketing the money themselves, is that then, at least if you take the money away, you're delivering the incentive to the place it belongs. But otherwise, it is kind of a tough issue to decide, and I'm especially skeptical of cutting trade or discouraging trade on those kinds of grounds. I mean, even more than kind of intergovernmental subsidies. But it's interesting. You said that nationalism seems so vibrant. I was wondering because during the Vietnam War, of course, there was North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and I actually never understood, what the real the landscape of opinion in those two parts of the country was toward one another. But you might think there would be enough in the way of lasting division that there wouldn't be a sense of a unified Vietnamese nationalism. But you're, but there, so far as you've been in both halves of Vietnam, and they seem to be on the same page, I gather.
Well, you got this weird thing, which is that Vietnam isn't. Most Americans thought of the Vietnam War as just a straight civil war, and it's not quite that simple because Vietnam is, in fact, like North Vietnam and South Vietnam are fairly distinct regions that weren't really a unified country in the way that, say Germany is, say France, and so it was sort of a civil war, but some people could also see it as like people who speak the same language. It's sort of like Holland invading Belgium or something. But what it is that in the same way that there was no Red America and Blue America after Al Qaeda attacked us, everyone here is so bitter about their neighbors that like
mainly China, but not only China.
Mainly, it depends on the country. Vietnam is by far the most worried about China, and by far the most obsessed with China. And the Cambodians, just from an informal survey, intensely dislike the Vietnamese, the Thais, and to a lesser extent the Chinese, and it's actually, sort of funny that our tour guide, all the tour guides hate the Asians here. All they do is sit around and tell us how happy they are to be. And most of the tourists here are South Koreans and Japanese.
Where are the tour guides from? You mean?
Well, they're Asians, but they sit around and tell us how much they hate other Asian tourists. They
the Asian tourists. I see. Okay.
Yeah. They like other Cambodians, but they hate people from other countries. And they're very vocal about how much they dislike people from other countries.
And is that just a carryover from their general antipathy toward those nationalities, or do those tourists actually behave differently from Western tourists?
They do behave differently. They're very, and I'm told that this is sort of what the countries are like. There's a lot of journalists here is that lining up is not really a cultural practice. In China or South Korea, and they travel in huge groups. Unlike the Europeans, it's really hard for them to get here, so they tend to be traveling in smaller groups, and they're relatively quiet, and there's 5 of them. The South Koreans come in. I can't say that I noticed that the South Koreans seem noticeably different, noticeably louder or more obnoxious to me than huge group of American tour buses in Mexico.
Right.
They seem about the same, but it's just huge groups of any nationality. And you look at all the tourists, and it's the same. They look like American tourists abroad. It's actually quite funny. They have their own weird idiosyncrasies. They all carry umbrellas.
For the sun, you mean?
So, yeah. So, and the men, too. They're just carrying these umbrellas around to keep the sun off. But they, they're dressed in really bright, loud tourist clothing. It's slightly different from bright, loud American tourist clothing, but it's really exactly the superficial differences only.
Do you wear bright, loud tourist clothing when you're in Southeast Asia, Megan?
No, because I had to pack for a business trip.
I see.
And I tend to eschew the bright, loud tourist clothing as much as possible. I dress, there's an aesthetic of Americans traveling in certain third world countries in Africa and Asia. There's a real type of the way that they dress. They've got sort of the women wear sort of gauzy clothing. You know what I'm talking about? that's visibly purchased. It's in some third world country, and I basically look about like that. Although I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt in Angkor Wat today, so I probably look just like every other ugly American. Anyway, sorry.
But you've been warmly received pretty much everywhere, and it reflects. Yeah. You think it reflects actual warmth toward Americans and Westerners generally?
I think so, because it's something that I've heard echoed elsewhere. I mean, they're just really friendly. And the Vietnamese, I think, and the Cambodians are just also very friendly people. Mm-hmm. And of course, like, I mean, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that at some point, like, despite the fact that I'm a journalist, I'm vastly richer than all of these people. And so I have, like, small amounts of money to me can be transferred to them, so they have an incentive to be friendly to us. But no, like, the language barrier is difficult because there's no one on this trip from our side except the local Vietnamese from the U.S. Vietnam Trade Council, who were amazingly helpful and were just really incredibly nice people. They spoke Vietnamese, but none of the journalists actually on the junket spoke either Vietnamese or Cambodian.
And the locals tend not to speak English. That is not a legacy of the Vietnam War.
No, actually, let me correct that. They do speak English, and there is an amazing. Everyone is obsessed with English. Everyone wants English before any other language here. They want English before Chinese. They want English before French, which is weird to me because their colonial history is French.
Yeah, but they're not enthusiastic about their colonial experience with the French, I think, right?
Well, I think they're no more enthusiastic than any other group and than any other place that has been invaded by Westerners, but they have a huge cultural, both in Cambodia and Vietnam, the food. By the way, I have to tell you, the food in Vietnam is the best food of anywhere I've ever been. Even the hotel food is good. Every single place I ate in Vietnam was amazing. And I've never had that experience traveling anywhere else. I did not have a bad meal or indeed a bad bag of banana chips. Vietnamese banana chips, surprisingly delicious. I would not have thought I would have liked them. The food in Cambodia is not quite as good, but both heavily French influenced. But they don't want, a lot of them do speak French, but what they want, everyone wants to learn English. Everyone wants their kids to learn English.
And are they teaching it in the schools systematically?
Yes. Not systematically. Not every school child learns English, but the affluent ones do. We visited a high school that was, clearly like an elite high school for Vietnam, and this is where you see how Vietnam isn't where China is yet, which is that this is an elite high school, and the kids there are, by Vietnamese standards, the equivalent of affluent American upper middle class kids. By American standards, they're still quite poor. And the textbooks in the school are sort of. So I was in the chemistry lab, and some of the textbooks are like 40 years old, and just sitting on shelves. And we would have things like that in our English class in my high school, but we certainly didn't have old textbooks for chemistry or whatever. And little things like that tell. It's all well equipped, and it's and the school fees are like $60, but the school fees are $60 a month, and that's half. That's half of what you make working in a garment factory. This is not a cheap school. Yeah.
And by the way, I had heard there's a pollution problem in the cities because of all the motorcycles. Is it very bad?
It's not just the motorcycles. It's the generators. It's the fact that clean coal hasn't really made it to Southeast Asia yet. Yeah, there's a huge pollution problem. The fuel here is of lower grade. The engines aren't as efficient. They're not clean. They don't have catalytic converters on them. Not everyone, but a really substantial portion of the population, I couldn't say whether it's more or less than half, but it's somewhere around there. They all go around with face masks, especially in Vietnam. But also it's trickling into Cambodia now. And so you'll see people, like a lot of people on motorcycles, like, you'll have to say 3 women on a motorcycle, and all of them will be wearing either a surgical mask or just a handkerchief tied across their face while they go.
And you think they're not exaggerating? It seems pretty bad to you, the air.
I've certainly been taking more asthma medication than I usually do, It's not as bad as I thought it would be. I mean, I was warned about sort of horrific levels of pollution, but there were people whose eyes were watering, and I coughed somewhat. It's it's definitely still like it's very much at the beginning stages of, and it makes you realize like environmentalism is a luxury good.
Yeah,
environmentalism is what you have after. You have enough to eat.
Well, even Western countries went through this developmental. I mean, London, England in particular, but it does seem to be a developmental stage where your priorities are different than they will be when you're affluent. Yeah.
This is a huge issue, though. What we do about global warming, and other environmental issues that are common environmental issues. I mean. My feeling about Vietnam is I'm not going to tell them whether they should want to have economic growth or, cheap factories. Mm-hmm. I think that's a decision that the people of Vietnam are a lot better equipped to make than I am. But then you have global warming and you have things like fisheries collapse and the Vietnamese and the Chinese and all of these incredibly poor countries participate in. And certainly, I do buy into the argument that the United States has more of an obligation to reduce emissions than China does, right? I mean,
the argument being that when we were in that developmental stage, we didn't have to worry about emissions. I mean, it being a kind of equity argument in that sense, or what?
Well, a little bit. So the problem with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is it's a stock. It takes 100 years for carbon dioxide to leave the atmosphere. There are other things that are much more powerfully greenhouse warming, but they tend to exit the atmosphere fairly fast. We produced most of that stock. We have put most of the carbon into the atmosphere that is so far.
That's also, actually an interesting way of reformulating, kind of the way I was thinking about it, but in a more rhetorically compelling way. I mean that is a product of what I said, which is that during our developmental phase we didn't worry about it, but when you can actually point to the stuff that we put up in the sky and say we're the ones who put it there and who should pay for getting rid of it, that is a more compelling way to put the argument. True.
But also, for us to reduce, we have so much. You're here and you don't, and you don't realize how much you have, and it's just like how much we throw away.
Right.
Just how much crap we throw away every day because it's too much of a pain in the ass. You just throw away your pen. You don't go and hunt for your pen. You just buy a new one because you can't figure out where you left it and it's too much trouble. Like Vietnamese people don't do that because that pen cost a big fraction of their income.
Yeah.
So like for us to conserve in many ways, it just costs us less in terms of actual
welfare,
enjoyment of life or welfare. But that said, it's not enough. Like, you look at Vietnam, right? It's got 85 million people. It's about the same number of people as Germany has. Germany emits 10 times as much greenhouse gases as Vietnam does. And Germany is, by the way, relatively, is one of 3 countries that's going to make its Kyoto targets. Although, to be fair, this is mostly because it shuttered a lot of East German industry. But that said, it certainly conserves more than the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. Say that, like, Germany manages to cut its emissions in half, right? And like Vietnam meets it halfway. Mm-hmm. That would still mean Vietnam would increase its emissions by 5 times. And the same math applies to China. The same math applies to any of these developing countries. It's like even if the West conserves by a fantastic amount, it can't conserve enough to allow these countries to develop to a level that we want to see them develop to. So I don't know, at least unless we get some sort of breakthrough renewable technology, which it could happen. You know, I'm not an engineer. I don't, or we make nuclear happen, whatever it is. But the other problem is that, of course, like these governments are mostly committed, especially China, but also Vietnam, because they have big reserves of it. Coal. They're very committed to coal. Mm-hmm. Because it's cheap, and like Cambodia, you look at Cambodia has basically no exploitable hydro. Vietnam doesn't have much exploitable hydro left, and so what are the options? They're going to be emitting. They want cars. They want all the stuff that we have. Getting around on a motorcycle with 3 people in the back is better than biking, but it's not or walking. And you realize you look at people in Vietnam, and not necessarily not all of them, or even a majority of them, but you look at people who are walking along the side of the road, and you realize like this is not like an American. This is someone who has to walk because he can't afford to do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And that factor, I don't know how we trade that off. The environment, the environment is not going to care whether the Vietnamese guy who got a car or a motorbike really needed the motorbike, and how much it improved his life, and how just it was, and how much fairer it is that he should have that than in America. It's the environment will heat up regardless of social justice questions.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the answer is. But it does sort of pause my ideas about fighting global warming.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to see some sort of like chart directly correlating, amount of reduction of the cost of in different countries, the cost of reducing, greenhouse gases in terms of increments of human welfare. I doubt anyone's actually. I mean, that's implicit in what you were saying about what kinds of actual human sacrifices they have to make to conserve relative to the ones we have to make. But I guess nobody's done the chart, right? I mean,
I don't even know. It would be so. I'm sure part of the problem is, right, if anyone did it, it would be so political, and certainly the numbers would be cherry picked to make the U.S. appear at the bottom of the list.
It would be hard. There is a certain amount of quantitative data, correlating, of course, income level, both in terms of national per capita income to happiness, and also individual income to happiness. And there are these cross-cultural studies, but I admit you'd have to fill in a lot more dimensions of the model before you could do anything. But it's an interesting way to think about it. So what about religion there? Is that it's basically Vietnam is basically Buddhist, right? Some Catholicism entered during the French colonial period, but does it seem like a very religious? Does Vietnam seem very religious to you, or Cambodia?
Cambodia seems very religious.
Huh.
We went to Angkor Wat today, and it was amazing. You're at Angkor Wat and you're looking at we went to another temple first. It was a ruined temple. We went there at 6 a.m. Which, by the way, for anyone who goes to Cambodia, the thing to do to avoid this just absolutely crushing load of tourists is to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go out on over a series of mornings, because there's no one there at 6. Or there's very few people there at 6. And you'll actually be happy to hear it's not that hard to get up at 6, because your body will be so screwed up that you'll wake up at 3 o'clock every morning anyway.
Right.
But we're out there, and all of a sudden we heard this music. We're getting out of the bus that they've chartered to take us to Angkor Wat. And it turns out that these whole villages, or family groups will pool together to get money to give to build the pagoda, to help build up the pagoda. And then they'll all get, and they're in, and I used to do this. I worked summers. I spent my summers on a ranch in Wyoming when I was in high school, the last few years of high school.
Yeah. Is that where you where the libertarian indoctrination happened? That's libertarian territory.
No, I was all environmental, and I was very.
You came back
very much into.
So that it happened.
I'm still an environmentalist, so I guess it's. I was not a libertarian back then. I'm not even sure I had politics in high school, really, except sort of extremely transitory, whatever my friends happen to believe.
That's still the way I do it.
I remember riding in it. Yeah, it's the best way.
Yeah.
So many fewer arguments at dinner parties.
And you're always popular.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll agree for food.
Yeah.
But I used to ride in a stock truck, which I remember is just one of the most awesome and fun experiences of my life, standing up in the back of one of these things. But so this whole village, there'll be 30 people crammed into one of these stock trucks, which are the ones with the really high white, the high fences along them, for people who don't know what stock trucks are. And they've got instruments and they've got costumes, and they're all coming to these already gigantic statues of Buddha to dress them up, and they brought all their instruments, and and I mean, this is it's a very small town, religious. It looks sort of like the Kiwanis going out for their annual outing or something, and it's very serious, right? They've raised a huge amount of money for this pagoda, in the same way that my grandparents, would go on these fundraising drives for their church. And I didn't see any of that in Vietnam, in part because I was just in the cities in Vietnam, I think, and cities tend to be less religious. But in Cambodia, the religion is surprisingly present, given that they had a dictatorship that did pretty much everything it could to completely stomp it out, along with everything else.
Well, sometimes that only strengthens it. But Vietnam is pretty strikes you as pretty secular. I mean, do people worship as a matter of course? Do they go through the rituals, or?
I don't know, actually. I mean, the people that we met never brought it up. Mm-hmm. It's like in America, I have no idea. Most of the people I meet, I have no idea whether they went to church or not. But in New York or D.C., I would assume the answer is not.
Well, I guess we're close to an hour. Let me close with a kind of related question. I happen to be listening to this show on the radio. Have you ever heard this show? It's Travel with Rick Steeb or Steebs or something like that. It's one of these shows you hear on NPR at 5:30 a.m. On Sunday or something. It's actually very good. But one thing he said was he was talking to the guy who started the Lonely Planet guide series of travel books, and he asked him if he considers travel a spiritual experience. And I kind of, there's a sense in which, international travel kind of is for me. Is there a sense in which it is for you?
Yeah. I think, certainly the ruined temple that we're at, my problem is I don't like being at tourist sites around other tourists, which is true of almost everyone, right? And I find it very hard to concentrate. Because the thing that I want to do, right, is try to experience this, how it felt to the person who lived there, and to just sit and sort of think, what did this look like when it was real, and how did it feel to be someone who's never seen a television, and for whom this gigantic temple is the apex of, is the best thing they've ever seen in the entire world. It's the largest thing, as far as they know, in the entire world, the most beautiful thing that's ever been created, and how did that look to them? And that's hard to do. But there are moments in this ruined temple I had one. I remember last year in Athens, not in Athens, actually on Rhodes, at this little Acropolis where almost no one goes, having the same sort of feeling of just for a second tapping into what a little bit of what this looked like and what it felt like, and why these places are sacred. Because places that have churches or whatever, they have that feeling, right? Not all of them, but the great ones do. It doesn't matter what the religion is. You walk in, and there is just a sense of this eternal thing that the designer and the people who worship there tapped into. It's incredibly powerful. And yeah, I think it's also I've been getting some flack on my blog for the sort of naivete of what I write about Vietnam and Cambodia, which is true. It is naive. I've been here for 10 days. I think it would be more awkward in a way if it wasn't naive, if I pretended that, if I read a bunch of briefing papers and then wrote, and then sort of just parroted them as if these were opinions that I had formed on my own. But I think that naivete is actually good. You go to, a lot of the things that I've learned viscerally are things that I knew. Mm-hmm. I knew that China and Vietnam were a problem environmentally. I knew that the places were polluted. I knew that these places were poor. But you don't really understand it until you see it, and it's not only real, but you can see a picture of something. But to experience something over and over again until it seems almost normal, that's when you sort of start to get it, I think. And so I find that incredibly spiritual. Incredibly, it's one of the things that I've been thinking as we were driving through the Cambodian countryside. My grandfather grew up on a farm, and a lot of my family are farmers, and then he left and and owned a gas station, but he's just always, there was so much of the farmer in him. He would drive, and he'd be doing 20 miles an hour in some strange place. Like, wow, I wonder what they're growing over there, and I wonder what kind of fertilizer they use on that. And And everyone used to make fun of him for doing this, and finally my grandmother had to drive the car so that he could admire all of the fields. And I was doing the same thing. I was looking at the cows, and I was sitting in front of a journalist who's written a book on Cambodia, and I was just asking her, sort of pointless questions, I guess, about what's that fodder, and how are they growing that there? And she didn't know the answers to all of them. And suddenly I said, I'm like my grandfather. And then but the thing that I tapped into is like the Cambodian farmers really remind me a lot of my relatives.
Well,
I think that farmers are the same everywhere.
Well,
so that's
when you describe it as a spiritual experience, is that part of what you're saying? A sense of kind of connection, a kind of deeper connection than you might have imagined across cultural borders, or? Well,
it's one of those things that, like, almost everything that's incredibly trite to say is also deeply, deeply true and moving. And one of the incredibly trite things to say is that people are really all the same everywhere. It's true. It's incredibly trite and overdone. But this really sort of drove this home to me. It's just that they're so much like my relatives, and it was really moving to tap in and say, farming. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting on a tractor or a water buffalo. The people, the way the people are, and I can't even explain what it is about them in particular. But there is something that is sort of patient about farmers.
Yep.
And stolid and conservative, but also really wonderful. That the Cambodian farmers remind me of, and so that sort of thing is really like, I find it. I think deeply, deeply spiritual. I've been incredibly happy here. Is one of the things I was realizing driving through the countryside. Is just that I'm just filled with this surprising peace, given how jet-lagged I am, and the fact that every 2 days I have to get up and lug my 800-pound overpacked suitcase from place to place.
Well, that's great. I'm glad we caught you at during a spiritual high. And I'm glad we could close on this note. It's Sunday morning here in the United States, and so I, naturally wanted to add some sort of quasi-religious flourish at the end. And you've exceeded the expectations I had when I asked you if it was a spiritual experience. That was great. And thanks for taking the time. When I was a kid watching the Vietnam War on TV and saw these big name TV correspondents reporting from Southeast Asia, I never dreamed that I would be on a first name basis with somebody who was a Southeast Asia TV correspondent, which you are now, Megan.
Wow, this is pretty amazing because the Vietnam War ended, for America at least, like a month after I was born. So.
Oh, did it really? Oh well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was pretty sure you had no memory of it, but I didn't realize that it was at least a close call there. Well, yeah, and it sounds like actually things have worked out in Vietnam. Given where we were in the mid-'70s as the war drew to a close, sounds like things have worked out not that badly. They got a ways to go, but when you look at what the whole rationale for the war was and how afraid we were of what the consequences of failure would be, it sounds like we can work with this.
Yeah, I think the dominoes were certainly incredibly cruel on the Vietnamese population, but they've ultimately fallen. I'm incredibly hopeful for Vietnam. I'm a little more frightened for Cambodia, but both places I think are recovering shockingly better than you would think, given the amount of devastation that's been wreaked on both of them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good, and thanks so much for taking the time, and especially.
My pleasure. This was great. I'm excited to be the Blogging Head's first exotic Southeast Asian correspondent.
You will forever have that distinction, Megan. And next time you're there, I hope you'll do another one of these. How much time do you have left there? A day or something?
I fly to Hanoi tomorrow, and then I fly home. I will get back to my house at 1:30 on Wednesday morning, thereabouts.
Well, then I feel even luckier that you took this time out, given how little time you have left. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you on a stateside dialogue at some point in the near future, I hope.
Excellent.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Okay.
Or day.
It's a morning. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.